At the end of World War II, two nations turned to a method of execution so brutal, so public, and so prone to failure that witnesses would remember it for the rest of their lives. Inside Czechoslovakia and Hungary, as the war came to a close, a method known as pole hanging was deployed to punish some of the most powerful and hated figures of the era. Former politicians, prime ministers, high-ranking members of the Third Reich, men and women who had tortured their nations for years. Pole hanging might sound straightforward, like a gallows, but using a pole instead of a crossbeam, but it was far from simple. It required an expert executioner and an assistant to carry out the method successfully, and often it went terribly wrong. For many reasons, pole hanging has been described as one of the most brutal execution methods in history. But if this was the case, why was it still used? And why was it chosen to bring the lives of some of the most powerful people of the 20th century to such a horrific end? This is the horror of pole hanging. Pole hanging was a short drop variant of the standard hanging method, but it utilized different equipment. Being a short drop meant that the condemned person would usually strangle on the pole. The drop was not sufficient to snap the neck. Death came slowly. The method originated in lands under the influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century. It was also known as the Würgegalgen, the strangling gallows, or the Austrian gallows. It involved many different steps, and this complexity was one reason why the pole was so troublesome when compared to something like the standard gallows. First, the condemned person was brought before a large crowd to their execution pole, or post. This was usually a wooden post embedded in the ground, standing around 3 meters high. Then the executioner, working with an assistant, would secure the condemned to the post and begin the procedure. They attached a rope around the feet of the victim and threaded it through a pulley at the bottom of the pole. The condemned was then hoisted to the top of the pole and held in place using a chest sling across their middle, suspended off the ground. A small noose was placed around the neck of the condemned and secured to a hook mounted at the top of the post. At this point, the condemned could not fall, held in place by the chest sling. But when the sling was released, the victim jerked downward in a short drop. The assistant executioner, using the foot rope at the bottom, helped guide the fall. Meanwhile, the main executioner would stand behind the post and attempt to manually dislocate the neck by shoving the head to one side as the body hit the bottom of the drop. Complicated, isn't it? But this method was actually very popular in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It was also used during the First World War on a mass scale. After World War II, the method was revived as the liberated countries sought to punish traitors, collaborators, and the men who had instigated terror regimes over them. Both nations had faced harsh German occupation or governments that collaborated with the Nazis. Both had suffered the loss of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, persecuted, arrested, sent to concentration camps. The pole hanging method may have been restored as the preferred way to punish war criminals because these countries wanted to break free from the chains of Nazism. They wanted to avoid using methods associated with the Germans, such as the guillotine or firing squad. But one of the main reasons why pole hanging was so brutal was because it was incredibly public. It was a method performed in front of huge crowds. Thousands of people, even children, flocked to see this method used in cities such as Budapest. People clambered out of windows to get a good view of the proceedings. For example, the pole hangings of members of the Arrow Cross Party, the collaborationist Hungarian political party, were witnessed by masses of people. They watched as some of their former government officials, including Prime Minister Ferenc Szalasi, met their end. After the method had been carried out on one of the condemned, the next person was brought out, and they had to see those who had gone before them, usually covered by a white sheet. Another problem with this method was that it often went very wrong. Some executioners claimed they could deploy the method efficiently and quickly, believing they could bring someone's life to an end in less than a minute. This was very optimistic. In reality, it usually went wrong, leaving someone slowly strangling to death. Their gasp for air, their twitching bodies fighting for life, all of it visible to the entire crowd who were allowed to stand close. For many of the witnesses, this was justice. For example, one man who suffered the pole at Pankrak prison was Kurt Daluege, a Nazi official responsible for the massacres of Czech villages, particularly after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. Daluege was also the chief of the Nazi order police. He had ordered the deaths of thousands of Czechs. He was pole hanged, and the crowd jeered as he was secured to the post. But he took many minutes to die once the drop was executed. The small drop was not sufficient to snap necks, and the method required the executioner to force the neck to the side, trying to manually dislocate it. It required expert coordination and timing to bring life to an end instantly, and it was very rare that this was successful. There were, in fact, too many variables that could go wrong. Shockingly, pole hanging was even used on women. One young woman who suffered this fate during the war was Ilona Bartos, who was accused of carrying a weapon during wartime. She was a member of a resistance group. Inside Hungary, she was sentenced to death in a military court and then publicly pole hanged. Her hanging was performed in front of an army barracks. She slowly strangled on the post. The sight of the lifeless body of the young woman was a terrible one. Another woman, Vera Kasparova, also suffered this fate, but she was different. She was a collaborator who worked for the Gestapo inside Czech lands. She helped translate interrogations, and through this work, her actions led to many people's deaths, shot for betraying the German occupation. She had a significant amount of power. Kasparova even ordered the Germans and the SS to shoot some men who had bullied her at school. Later, this came back to haunt her. At her trial, she said, and I quote, "I know that I caused the deaths of several people. I acted out of revenge." On the evening of September 13, 1946, she was pole hanged. When she saw the post for the first time, she fell to her knees and fainted. She had to be carried out by the guards. She screamed, winced, terrified. The drop did not kill her instantly, and for a number of minutes afterward, her body was seen violently twitching and quivering until death was finally confirmed by a doctor. Pole hanging was a method used on dozens of war criminals at the end of the Second World War. There were much more reliable methods used by the Allies, but to the Czech and Hungarian governments, reliability was not the priority. They wanted to inflict pain. Pole hanging was not pain-free, neither was it quick. It did not necessarily take into account the condemned having a rapid death, and it was something that could prolong suffering for some time. Eventually, it was outlawed and banned in these countries. Today, it is a thing of the past, but pole hanging remains one of the worst execution methods ever used to bring someone's life to an end. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please take a moment to subscribe channel. Once again, thank you for giving up your time to watch. We'll see you in the next one.